go.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Basically, this is a talk about digital fabrication and just some experiences we've had with Girl Geek Academy. And really, the overview is Girl Geek Academy is a group, and what we've done with something called She Makes, which is really sort of our diversity aspect. This is I go through a bit of a 3D printing 101. Just it just depends on the audience. Some people are new, some people not. 3D printing and enhancing creativity in the collective ecosystem. Basically, what has happened in the 10 years that I've been involved in 3D printing, how it's evolved, where it is now, and just some of the things that are coming out of there. Communities and crafts. So there's a bit of an intersection between what we would have once called craft and what we also now call making, and just explaining what my observations from that. And then looking at 3D printing as an enabler, like it's enabled me to be able to manufacture goods that I wouldn't have been able to do in the past. And also female makers. So, are there any differences and how can we make that better? Girl Geek Academy, our mission is to teach 1 million women technical skills by 2025. Those are the founders. I'm one of the co-founders. We started off as Girl Geek Dinners back in the day, and it was like a social kind of movement where we just wanted to hang out and talk about tech without necessarily being intimidated. It was very hard. You go to a meetup and you'll be like one of the only two girls. So this was kind of like a social thing that started off and then became a bit more involved, and we started running workshops and we grew and grew. So they're the founders. She Makes is an event that we run. It's a bit like this, but a lot smaller. And it's really a maker fest for women. It's an annual event. And we sort of try to do it so that, I think things have changed now. There's probably more women than when I first started. But it was just trying to introduce the technology in a safe kind of environment, welcoming environment. And, okay, so I'm not going to go into 3D printing 101. This is really basic stuff. Most people know this. What is additive fabrication or digital fabrication? Additive fabrication is a process of taking a three-dimensional solid object, a virtual object from a computer file or digital model and making it. Using additive technology means I'm basically adding material rather than taking material away. So, I want to create a physical thing. I'll basically put layers of a material down. And there's other techniques, but this is the most common, which is what you would see in a sort of budget kind of domestic 3D printer. And I'll basically be able to create that curve using material and layers of material. There are all sorts of different ways to do it, but this is by far the most common. I won't go into that. It all started with, and this is probably important because sharing an open source was one of the things when I started. That was my first printer, was a Cupcake CNC. And it's a dinosaur by today's standards. It's a bit of a relic if you've got one. It's probably going to be worth a fortune one day. But it was this thing that was revolutionary because, I had heard about 3D printers, but they were sort of in the realms of commercial organizations and not something as me as maker could actually access. And I used them to really to create props for science fiction. And actually, just to start with, I just made a costume for my son. But what really revolutionized this was really the open source movement. The fact that at the same time when we're sharing the models and sharing the designs, you're starting to get cheap electronic parts and things out of China, and everything's becoming much more accessible. So makers are able to now make 3D printers and at a budget. So I think that was on the Kickstarter for the Cupcake CNC, and I think it was about $1,500, which was really cheap compared to everything else. But now, it's a dinosaur. Then, it evolved. So these are the two other rep wraps, printers that have been printed using other printers, and they're dinosaurs now. But that was I had a theme. I made them all pink or purple. There's a Prusa and then a Mendel Max, and they started to evolve. So 3D printing, as far as enhancing creativity, so it's all about being able to materialize something real and tangible from your own imagination, or perhaps building and leveraging off the creativity of someone else. So this is really a very important part, and really when it comes down to things like the open source movement, one of the things that has happened over the years is that if I want to build something, I don't necessarily need to start from first principles. I don't need to manufacture the bolts, for example. I will go buy bolts. And the same is true with a lot of 3D models. If I want to make something, particularly if it's just like for fantasy or science fiction, there's probably models there that I can take and I can alter, as long as I adhere to some of the rules for open source, so share and share alike. What this does, though, is you end up with this creative ecosystem. If you go out into and have a walk around, you'll see an R2-D2 being driven around. That's a Star Wars droid. That one is, I think it's a more traditional manufactured R2-D2, but if you come over to the Go Geek Academy booth, there is a 3D printed R2-D2 that has, now some of that is actually my modeling, but most of it's actually come from club files and about 15 different people who have collaborated online, shared the models, and you know, I'm able to basically make an R2-D2 and just print it, and maybe I want to customize it, and then the parts that I've customized, I share them back in so someone else benefits from that. You know, there's all sorts of different things that different makers use. For example, I don't like using PLA. I will never use PLA. I will use PETG and ABS because I like to make things really robust and strong. So, but some people like using PLA, which is a cornstarch. It tends to be a lot more flimsy, so they will over-engineer a model to compensate for the material. And one of the first things I normally do is cull the models, take all the stuff that you just don't need out of them and make them simpler and easier to print. Makers that have access to digital fabrication tools such as 3D printing and have that advantage. You know, now I've got the online world intersecting with the physical world. I can make stuff based on other things that would be really hard to do from first principles. Yeah, and things like, you know, very simple stuff like creating jewelry, for example. You can also use bureaus and things like that. It's very hard to leverage that kind of thing if you're going to do that and have to have your own foundry and other equipment. So crafting or to craft or to make. So this is really interesting, and I like walking around at this particular event and just having a look at a lot of stuff would have been probably considered craft. And some things are probably, you know, considered making, but really, where's the line? And, you know, what is, if you look at digital fabrication, you look at 3D printing, is it like just another sewing machine? Is it the sewing machine of the 21st century? If used in that manner, can you use it for craft? Do you call yourself a crafter or do you call yourself a maker? You know, is it, you know, are those worlds sort of coming together? It's my really bad animation. So 3D printing crafts or making stuff, it's all about making. It hasn't really changed. You're trying to actually make something. And rarely in crafts do you use one single tool or technique. You tend to augment. And it's not really about the technology. I don't really care that it's 3D printed. I want to make, you know, I've got an end goal bias. I want to come up with something. And makers, as we all know, you know, makers often augment 3D printed items. So particularly what I do, you know, you paint them, you use fillers, you get rid of the print lines, you might put electronics in there and so on. So 3D printing really complements the crafts. It doesn't really replace it. I know when we, you know, sometimes when I give this talk, people think, oh, it's all just about printing. But no one, you know, it's a bit boring now, and that if you just go to a stand, they've just got lots of 3D printed things. It's like, yeah, okay, everyone can just hit print and, you know, print a thing. Where's the creativity, right? If you're just downloading things from Thingiverse and printing them, it doesn't take a lot of creativity to do that. And making is much more than that. So just some things about, you know, 3D printing casts. What are you making? Is it small? Is it jewelry? Are we talking about like things like war game figurines? Do you want to use a bureau rather than doing it yourself? depending on what's the best option for that. Large things, is it, costume props, which is something I do, ornamental displays, functional items, does it have to have a gearbox? The R2-D2 is a great example because it uses everything from those realms. It has gears, it has motors, it has electronics. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. I still haven't finished it. It's going to take me ages. So 3D printing process limitations are size and the quality that are available to craft makers or crafters. There are often limitations. People have limitations on the printers they have. A lot of people buy these large format printers thinking they can fit and print something as big as the format, and they're quite often disappointed that it doesn't quite work that way. Using 3D printing bureau services is not often as flexible or cost effective. So if you're trying to use a bureau to do stuff, particularly if you're trying to prototype and trying to see how things work, it takes me to get some of the stuff I make 3 or 4 goes and changing the models to actually get them just 100% right, because I've got to allow for shrinkage, I've got to allow for all sorts of things. And having that quick turnaround is really important. But if I'm just making jewelry and I want to make it in metal, I can prototype it in plastic, and I can then get it printed in gold or silver or whatever. Gold-plated brass is my favorite. And then there's also considerations on the technology you're using. If you're using a fused deposit type, FDM type printer, you've got to think about how you're going to print it with vertical, horizontal, how you're going to get the detail and so on. Then things like 3D printable fabrics and fashion. So this is a design that I've come up with. It's actually blown up, but if you've got, it actually prints like a hex, and it's, if you overlay in the model on the print bed with these different segments, there's joining segments and so on, on your slicer, if you use, I use Simplify 3D, it's really easy. You just position them correctly and print them, and then they'll interlock, so you can actually make a dress. I should have really had one for this event, but I just, I've put on weight, it doesn't quite fit. It's not very flexible. It's a bit uncomfortable right now. It's a little bitey. I'm using some of the new materials TPU is great, but I just find it's really hard to print with stuff like this because of the bridging and everything. And then you've got the multi-part, so you want to be able to clean it and take it apart and get in and out of stuff. So 3D print, 3D model, 3D print, and then maybe you can make a mold. That's the other thing that crafters quite often do. This is very popular, very common, whereas if you want to make a lot of something, 3D printing isn't often the best way to do it. I started doing this. I now just 3D print everything because I got sick of mold making. I just found it really messy, and I hate mess. I'm a bit pedantic. My biggest problem with this particular venue is the dirt. There's too much dust. Every time I bend over, I get patches on my knees. Okay, and then what sort of materials you're using is quite important. So, a lot of people use PLA because PLA is easy to work with. PLA, for people who don't know, is dimensionally stable. It's the favorite material for most makers who use 3D printing because you print it at that size, it stays that size. ABS was designed to shrink because it was designed to be injected into a mold, cool down, shrink, and pop out of the mold, right? So it's been designed to shrink, which is a real problem when you're trying to print because as it cools, it shrinks. So you have to have a printer that's enclosed and has a constant temperature. And I've got some, if you want to have a look. They're insulated, and they print at about, the internal temperature is about 70 degrees. And I can print in ABS really well. The other materials like PETG has become really popular. It's actually pretty good, although really hard to try and clean. Have you ever tried to clean PETG off something? You've got to use a blowtorch. So I think the revolution is really going to come from materials in that regard. Finishing tricks, high resolution, spray putties, a favorite. Everyone knows spray putty, gets rid of the print lines. Acetone vapor, it's a great idea. I've never really tried to do this on mass. I find it's just too volatile. But basically sanding, smooth on, there's a whole bunch of things. Everyone's got their own little technique. But it's all about how you actually want to finish something off. So if you want it to not look like it was 3D printing, you can use different finishing techniques. And I've actually written something about it. You can probably, I'm not sure if this gets shared online, but there are a whole bunch of YouTube videos about how to finish stuff, and you follow that link. One of the things with 3D printed crafts is, you can have some functional advantages, like they can work, they can actually do things. So, these are gauntlets for like a Boba Fett kind of character, and they actually have a latch and a thing, and they click on your arm. And one of the other things I do with these is I make them for people and I size them. So I get the measurements and I actually print for their size. So I can do the whole, I've got a whole costume on a mannequin which is all 3D printed, and I will size that to an individual. So I'll take their height, relative sort of sizing, and helmet as well. Helmet sizing is always fun because people are really horrible at measuring their head. It just doesn't happen. There's only like 3 basic sizes of human heads as far as I know. But, you try telling that to people. Okay, multi-part models. This is really old, so I just kept it there because it's got lots of pink. But I was running out. Back in the day, that's how I had to print, like lots of little small parts in ABS, because the ABS quality was terrible and my printer was really dodgy. And you can imagine doing it on a little cupcake CNC. Well, actually, it was a Mendel Max by this stage. So that's an Alien pulse rifle from the movie Aliens, and it was printed in lots of little parts, and I was the first in the world. That was like years and years ago now. Now everyone's doing them. And then using 3D scanning, right? So one of the things is trying to augment models to fit human heads, right? People get these things, these anime characters, and they want a helmet made, and I'm like, that you'll never be able to see out of that. And they're like, yes, I will. And I go, no, you won't. Your eye is not here. So I take a scan. I just use like the Connect to do this because it doesn't need to be that accurate. I just need to get a rough idea where your head is and be able to move and position it. Now I sort of don't even bother with that. I sort of know roughly where the human head will have eyes. So I can augment models to fit, and most people can't tell that the models have been changed. But it's something that's really important. Being able to see out of a helmet is actually really important. This is like a Japanese animation called Appleseed, I think. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Creativity Online Collective. RPF is a really good one. That's a replica prop forum. Obviously, a bunch of stuff on Thingiverse. People tend to if you're a software person, you have a thing called SourceForge. We call it source forget. You put stuff on there because you don't ever want to deal with it again. And I find Thingiverse is a bit like this. I've got stuff on there that's really old and never really want to deal with it. Just some of the stuff I've done. I was at the premiere for The Force Awakens when I 3D printed BB-8. I had to buy BB-8 a ticket because he counted as a human. And then I dressed up because I'm a nerd. Open source props, again, I spoke about this before, really about sharing your collective models. Now 3D printing is an enabler. So here I've got this technology that has given me this capability to make stuff I've never thought I could actually make because I didn't have the skills. Or I thought I didn't have the skills. But with all this collaboration, particularly online, people share ideas. You get inspired by other people, particularly women. And a good example is the prop community. The sharing of props and things is amazing. And it's grown to the point now where, I was one of the first, and now there's like, I can't even count how many people are doing what we're doing. And anything bespoke, basically, emerging market and anything bespoke. This is some jewelry I created. I'm not a jeweler. I've got no idea how to make jewelry, but I made some jewelry. I 3D printed a cross between Boba Fett and Hello Kitty so I can get sued by 2 companies in one go. But I don't sell this. It's like just a thing I did for myself. And I got it printed in gold. And that wasn't that bad. It wasn't as expensive as you think. This is something I came up with a model for a snowspeeder. I printed it, and then we made it full scale. So that was in Melbourne at PAX, and there's me sitting in the cockpit. We still have to finish printing the dashboard, but that will come eventually. But that was CNC machined based on a 3D model. And I never thought I would be doing stuff like this. And it's amazing. And then the other thing we did with this is we made it so that we could prototype how it came apart in about this scale so that it could go onto a trailer. Because it was really important to be able to transfer it because you can't fit a snowspeeder down a road. It's too wide. The wings come off. But you can't tell that the wings come off, and that was the trick. So female makers or crafters, these are actually some of my 3D printers. You can see the theme. They're actually the older ones, but they're still pretty good. So numbers. So if you went and took crafters and you look at something like Etsy and how many females are on Etsy and looked at people who are makers, there's this thing that says like there's more male makers than there are female makers. Maybe there's more female crafters than there are male crafters. But really, is there a difference? If the worlds are converging, there's probably more makers in general than you maybe think. And it's understanding the motivation. So particularly when I started, I had a bunch of guys I was with at the makerspace who were they wanted 3D printers, and they had no reason to have them. I had a reason to have them. They wanted to tinker with them. And actually one of the things was, one of the groups was called the Tinker Lab, and I thought that was a great name. Whereas most of the women I know actually want to do stuff. They have an end goal. Maybe it's just, a cultural thing, I don't know. But that was just an observation. I haven't got any real facts behind that. It's just my observation through the makerspace. But I definitely had an end goal, and I wanted to make props. If you look at data from Etsy, this is 2015. So it's a bit out of date, but this is when I actually wrote this presentation. The majority of sellers, 78%, are female. And it's actually a really interesting stat. And Etsy is basically a craft marketplace, an eBay for crafters. Makers, microbusiness, gender, and driving the new economy. So there was a report done in 2017 by Etsy on US Etsy sellers. This is US data. 87% were women, and they were more likely to be younger than your typical business owner. More than half operated their own micro business for the first time, and as many as 28% lived in rural communities. So, and last year that accounted for $2.8 billion that was traded on Etsy in craft. So you can't say this is like a trivial thing anymore. There's actually a big market. So and if you look at the new economy, Etsy want to achieve success on their own terms. This is like some data that was collected, that the Etsy sellers want to achieve success on their own terms. Most of them run their workshop from home. More than 3/4 are one-person operations. And most consider the shop to be a business, and they don't conform to typical stereotypes of mum and pop shops. In a micro-business operation, US Etsy sellers prioritize flexibility and creativity in addition to the bottom line. It's basically what I do. And I'm an Etsy seller. They may be micro-businesses, but they create economic impact. 32% of Etsy sellers, their creative business, both on and off Etsy, is their sole occupation. They don't have another job. Now, I have another job, so I do this as a side business, but I find it's quite expensive to build stuff, to make stuff in Australia. So there's really interesting statistics. And Etsy sales represent a larger changes in the economy, with more and more people pursuing opportunities outside of the traditional 9-to-5 paradigm. The majority of US Etsy sellers work independently, and only 32% have traditional full-time jobs. So big dollars, changing economy. So I think it's really interesting where it's going. And this, I guess, US data, but it's still very interesting. The independent workers in the USA account for $1 trillion of the US economy. So, yeah, very interesting. Makerspace movement emphasizes democratization of technology and tools. And it's easy for makerspaces to become quite male-dominated. But I find, I think recently that's actually changing. I've got the wrap-up. I think we're done. So there's more stuff I can go going. Okay, here you go. This is a bit out of date. Should have changed that one. Some references. And I think that's it. Thank you.